and basically the Tomb of Gilgamesh, which we had talked about, and all of the ancient artifacts. And by the way, again, I've gone on record since that story came out that I was told by the special operations people that they were after the technology. But listen, it's the 72 jinn and the surah, as you pointed out, Surah 72, that we're seeing the number 72 associated with what you and I would call, obviously, the Nephilim. Obviously, what is being associated with this specific cave is that it's one of the wonders of the world. It's 320 meters in length, 228 meters in width, and 120 meters in height. They say you can put the entire immediate Giza plateau in one of the rooms, you know. So what's happening now is that there have been a lot of people that have gone in there, but things are happening, Tom, where a lot of these caves that had been previously attributed to the historic habitation or the, if you will, incarceration of either the jinn or the giants, they're all becoming active on a worldwide level at the same time. In other words, where it used to be just myth, a legend, and the locals feeling spooky, now these places are being closed and a very strong military presence is showing up. So, interestingly enough, you and I are doing this show. It's the 22nd of July, 2010, and this is coming to the forefront again. The first time this was spoken about was in March 1928. I'm sorry, not 1928, 2008. But now the activity, and interestingly enough, I got a call from a guy that's boots on the ground over there, and he said, whoa, is there some activity involving the stuff you guys, meaning you and Tom Horn, talk about? He said, I'll get your report. That's all I better say on that. So the point is I'm sorry, the point is that, look, this 72 is significant. Obviously, you mentioned Pythagoras. The numbers are critical. This is not numerology to the occultists. It's numerology for occult's sake. But God himself established the foundations of the universe, and God said his people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, not because they're not presented with it, Tom, but because they choose not to believe it. So all we're doing is giving a warning, giving an understanding, and the fact is that the gates are opening, and I want to use a word, and then you can address it wherever you want to, but it's the Goetic, G-O-E-T-I-C, demons, 72 of them, and it's like the word in the occult community is we're coming back, and it seems like everything now is triggered. How that figures into the enhanced super soldier and what we would call the transhuman species, it's amazing. Even DARPA announced the other day that now they have their robots that can, they had talked about kind of a toy train that could eat human matter. Yeah. Now that's on the plate again. Actually, you carried it on Raiders, and I picked it up from you. But so here's the thing. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a new lunch being prepared. That's the good news. The bad news is we're all on it. You know, we're the menu items. Continue.
Well, you've got my brain spinning now, Steve, because you mentioned this. If you said Majlisi, that is part of the Islamic tradition. It does relate to the jinn, but it also, Steve, is combined. There's an ancient prophecy, for instance. There's a Hadith tradition sacred to Shiite Islam from the 17th century. And many people believe that the arrival of President Obama set in motion the fulfillment of this prophecy that has to do with the releasing of these jinn, because the Shiite Islam, Majlisi tradition, predicts that just before the return of the Mahdi, the end times redeemer of Islam, and I'll just quote it, quote, a tall black man will assume the reins of government in the West. This leader will command the strongest army on earth, will bear a clear sign from the third Imam, Hussein, end quote. And that prophecy concludes that Shiites should have no doubt that he is with us. Well, is that talking about Obama as the one who would come and set in motion the releasing of these jinn, the opening of the 72, if you will? It's a question that was asked by Forbes magazine, October of 2008. Is Obama the fulfillment of this prophecy? And a scholar, an Islamic scholar by the name of Amir Tahiri, did the research for Forbes magazine in 2008 and pointed out how Obama's first and second names, Barack Hussein, mean the blessing of Hussein in Arabic and Persian, while his family name, Obama, written in the Persian alphabet, reads Obama, which means he is with us, which, according to Forbes magazine's scholar, fulfilled the magic formula in Majlisi's tradition. It actually uses the same word that you're using right now, talking about these caves, upon which is based the concept, well, you know, that even the Mahdi comes up out of a stargate, comes up out of a hole, comes out of a cave. That's a significant part of their tradition. It's very much tied to the 72 demons. In fact, there's also 72 virgins that the martyrs of jihad get when they go to heaven. That's how important this number is in mysticism in different cultures. And then what makes this even more important is how we're seeing, just since what George Bush set in motion and Obama continues to carry forward, that we are seeing unfolding in the world all around us, these manifestations now. You sent me also yesterday by the Judea Market, the investors group, 72 analysts, who are saying now that gold is going to go parabolic to between 2,500 and maybe even as much as 15,000. And as you say, not 71 economists, not 74 economists, but 72. And another thing that just now pops into my head with regard to the arrival of Obama as the fulfillment of Majlisi's Islamic tradition and this prophecy of a tall black man who would assume the role of government in the West, which then is going to set in motion the coming of the Mahdi and the opening of these gates through which these supernatural presences are going to be manifested. David Flynn emailed me, and this has been, maybe 2 years ago, about the two witnesses of the end times who resist the Antichrist, and they prophesy for 1,260 days. And the point that David was making at that time was, Tom, if, as all these ancient cultures that you're talking about, particularly the Maya, but many other cultures, if they're seeing December 21st, 2012 as the end of time and the dawn of a new age, and if this has anything to do with the two witnesses that are in the Bible, he said, count backward 1,260 days from their arrival on Earth, and you have July 11, 2009. Well, what would that have to do with the arrival of the Antichrist and the number 72? Recall that President Obama said earlier in his last year that remember he said, it was just right after his inauguration, he said, the next 100 days will be so successful that I will complete them in 72 days, and on the 73rd day, I will rest. Remember that?
Right. Now, who else said they rested? This is important because he said that they would, he would design, build, and open a library dedicated to my first 100 days. He then added what you just said, Tom. I will be able to complete them in 72 days, and on the 73rd day, I will rest. He's also on record as saying, I can't quote directly, but that basically he's done what he was supposed to do. Someone said, why is he spending so much time on the golf course and basically fiddling while Rome burns?
Yeah.
The answer to that is he's waiting for his instructions from, in my opinion, his controllers. I'm talking unseen controllers. And the point being is that for him to make that statement, I would say this: open wide, O stargates, for the Prince of Hell is coming on the scene. That's my interpretation of that.
Well, what David Flynn was saying, and then what I watched as it unfolded was how on the 72nd day, that's the way I'll complete them in 72 days, on the 73rd day I will rest. On the 72nd day of his administration, he met privately with the Pope. And on the 73rd day of his presidency was Saturday, July 11th, exactly 1,260 days before December 21, 2012. So it seems like, once again, the Illuminatus, the conspirators, but when I say conspirators, I'm talking more about the invisible ones, right? That I am the ones we see.
Too.
Yeah, that it's as if they are playing a game. Well, anyway, it's so Jewish mystics, Kabbalists, who rely on the mystical power of 72 names of God. Also, have you noticed lately that they're in the news, wearing their magic armbands in large numbers?
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what they think they know. New York Governor David Patterson, he was in the news just last week wearing his red string Kabbalah bracelet to bind the evil eye and the 72 demons. Now, you mentioned a moment ago the Goetia. In mysticism, the number 72 is combined directly with the Goetia. This is a text that deals with the summoning and the control of both 72 angels and 72 evil spirits, but it's mostly for the controlling of 72 evil spirits or demons. And that is taken from what's called the Lemmegeton, or the lesser key of Solomon. That was made famous or infamous by Aleister Crowley because he republished it. He put it in common language. But the Goetia teaches the magical practice of the invocation of angels and the evocation of demons. 72 angels, 72 demons. Now, what does any of this have to do with our previous 4 hours about transhumanism in America and gateways that would combine even to what we've already been saying now about Obama and the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy? The bottom line is that the ultimate act of transhumanism will be realized in the coming of the Antichrist. And how that is related to Washington, D.C., and Freemasonic mysticism and the number 72, I think that, Steve, now that's the crux. That's the core of the matter. That's the most fantastic open secret in the history of mankind. And so if I can set this up so that it's most effective, first let me say something about Washington, D.C., and the coming of the ultimate transhuman, the Antichrist. And then how the number 72 is fantastically related in the most occultic way in D.C. for the opening of that gateway, or Stargate, as you and I have been referring also as esotericists like William Henry in his last book, referring to the 72 starred Stargate. That's the term he used in the U.S. Capitol Dome. But first, what is most unrecognized by the vast majority of people around the world, including that very large film and acting crew that the History Channel sent to meet me in Washington, D.C. last week, and I could go into all the details, but I think it would detract from what we're talking about. They, too, were absolutely unfamiliar with what was going on there. And what's interesting, Steve, is that I've been interviewed now over the last year by 33rd degree Freemasons. I've been interviewed by congressmen. I've been interviewed by senators, all of whom walk back and forth and see all this imagery. And not one to date, not even among the 33rd degree Free Council, Freemason leadership of the Freemasons, Scottish Rite Freemasonry, have disputed what I am saying. That laying right out in the open in Washington, D.C., and of course also at the Vatican, although we're not going to talk about the Vatican, but is this ancient talismanic diagram. You have a primeval concept, and this was designed in antiquity for only one reason: regeneration, resurrection, apotheosis, literally for deity incarnation from the underworld to the earth's surface in the body of a man, through the union of these two respective figures, the dome, which is the ancient structural representation of the womb of Isis, and the obelisk, which is the ancient structural representation of the erect phallus of Osiris. Now, just so people who may email you and ask, what am I talking about? I'll just try to do this in 20 or 30 words. But in ancient times,
do it more tactfully than I would. So I'll let you do that one.
Yeah. Well, in fact, when I was interviewing with the Washington Monument, they didn't even know what phallus meant, and they wanted me to use a more, contemporary phrase, and I said, I just can't do it. If they don't know what it means, they're going to have to figure it out on their own. But the obelisk represented that part of Osiris, his male organ, which Isis was not able to find after Osiris was killed by his jealous brother Set, who then chopped him into 14 pieces and threw all the pieces into the Nile River. Some of the pieces, according to myth, floated down the Nile River, got hung up on the limbs of a tamarisk tree. But Isis, his sister and wife, she was and is considered in Freemasonry and all these other mystical orders to be the queen of magical skills. Well, she searched the riverbank, recovered all of these missing pieces, but the one piece she couldn't find was his male organ. It had, some myth says it was swallowed by a fish. Plutarch says it was swallowed by a crocodile. The point was she gathered these 13 pieces. Now this is really important. She assimilated these 13 pieces, put them back together. And I won't drift off into this, but I think there may be something here that has to do with advanced cloning or technology, the taking of reanimating DNA. But I won't go into all that. She brings this together, these 13 pieces, and then she constructs an obelisk, which she puts in the place of his missing male organ, and then uses it to magically impregnate herself. And she draws, through the obelisk, she draws forth the seed of Osiris from his corpse into herself, and she becomes impregnated with Horus, who is the resurrected Osiris. Now, that legend formed the core of Egyptian cosmology. Everything essentially is based around that legend. And this was venerated all throughout Egypt on the most imposing scale. That's the reason why everywhere you go in Egypt, you found these towering obelisks, including even at Karnak, where the upright obelisk of Osiris was vitalized or stimulated from the warmth, the energy of the masturbatory sun god, Ra, shining down upon it. This is the reason why, by the way, that the Washington obelisk is the largest of its kind in the world, so as to be constructed to be the very first thing that the sun strikes when it rises over the capital city of Washington. In any case, and by the way, you said you'd use a more crude term than I did. I realize that, modern people, and especially here in America, it might look at some of these symbols as profane, pornographic. In a way, they are.
Well, yeah, but and let me just deal with the obelisk real quick. When you find them not only in Washington, D.C., and I know this sounds sarcastic, but where else would you expect the biggest phallus symbol to be but in Washington, but all over the world? That was, and even in all of the monoliths and the megaliths and the stones that are littered throughout the world, the phallus and the circular stones, that the whole thing was venerating the fallen angels having sex with earth women. It's like the way it was, can I say this? It was the most infuriatory symbolism. In my opinion, in the face of a living God. Do you follow, Tom?
That's right.
in essence, they were shaking their fist at heaven. They were pulling a Nimrod on steroids. And again, the fact that some people say, well, Washington and the United States aren't in the Scripture. Oh, yes, they are. Spiritual Babylon? How would you not expect spiritual Babylon to have the biggest, most confrontational affront towards heaven? And that's what Americans cannot understand, and 99% of American Christians, because they don't understand the symbology or the power, the supernatural power behind it, are in the way of being slaughtered, lest God grant the grace for them to wake up and call upon Him.
Yeah, that's right. This was also known in history as Baal's shaft, which, of course, Baal is he's the perpetual enemy, if you will, of God throughout the Old Testament, or one of the Baals. But from a mystical point of view, and this is where it goes to Washington, D.C. and the Freemasons as well, these were objects. They were magical objects. And if the right ceremonies were conducted in the use of them, this was believed in ancient Egypt. It's also believed in modern Washington, D.C. at the Herodome, the headquarters of the 33rd degree Scottish Rite Freemasonry, which maybe we'll talk about in a moment. But these ritualized objects, they believed that if the proper ceremony was conducted around them, it would endear you to the invisible presences, to the invisible gods, to these 72 demons, if you will, and it could produce tangible manifestations within the material world. The obelisk and the dome, as imitations of the deity's male and female reproductive organs, could, and what's interesting, Steve, in fact, it is germane to this study, is that this had to happen through government representation. In other words, just some Egyptian somewhere who wanted to invoke the power of the gods couldn't go out and just fashion an obelisk and think that he was going to somehow use it with his wife or something to give birth to one of the gods. This had to happen through government representation, according to Egyptian belief, and through government representation, it could invoke into existence the being or the beings that were symbolized by these phallic symbols. And that's the reason why inside the temple, the dome, the womb of Isis, temple prostitutes representing the human manifestation of the goddess were there available for ritual sex as a form of imitative magic. I won't even go into some of the stuff they did there, including what they did with animals. But the purpose for it was that through this imitative sex, the dome and the obelisk would become energy receivers that would be capable of assimilating Ra's essence from the rays of the sun, which in turn would heat the obelisk and draw forth the seed of the underworld, Osiris. The seed of the dead deity would move up, according to the supernaturalism, through the base, the testes of the obelisk, up through the stem of the obelisk, and would emit into the dome. It would emit from the head of the obelisk into the dome of Isis. And in that way, Osiris could be born again or reincarnated as Horus over and over again, because inside the dome, well, was the Pharaoh, who then became the receptacle. So first of all, you understand the magical side of it. And then you ask yourself, okay, but in practical terms, so somebody's performing, some form of high occultism in ancient Egypt. So what? In practical terms, how does the god become, how does he get flesh? How does he walk upon earth in a body? Well, in practical terms, Osiris was raised during what's called the raising ceremony, which we'll tie to Freemasonry here in a second if I can remember to. In Egypt, where Osiris was brought to life through these magical constructs, Pharaoh would enter into that holy womb temple. And he became the fit extension. This is also a term that is used actually in the Septuagint of the Old Testament. It says that when the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fit extensions. This is exactly the same term that is used in Egyptian terminology. The Pharaoh became the fit extension for the reborn God to take residence in as the sex act was ritualized there at the site, actually the largest religious structure ever built, the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak. Pharaoh would enter into the Holy Womb Dome temple, where he became the receptacle of the spirit of Osiris during what was called the Festival of Opet. And this was a festival, and I won't go into it. It was held at the Temple of Luxor. But eventually the Pharaoh, they'd go down the river, everybody's standing on the side of the river, heralding the one who is to become the god, all that. He would enter the Holy Womb Temple beyond the obelisk where the raising ceremony was conducted. This is the same ceremony as Freemasons in Washington, D.C. conduct until this day.
Right. I think it's critical that people understand, too, because, again, a lot of people who will talk about the Illuminati, talk about the New World Order, they don't go back to its pharaonic roots. And obviously, Antichrist is a type of pharaoh. Isn't it interesting, like the tall man that was in the prophecy in the 1700s, all through Egypt, he was, pictured with Pharaoh Tutankhamun's headdress or the pharaonic authority? You know what I'm talking about, Tom. You carried that story and even put the picture up on Raiders. So the thing that I think people have got to understand is that just as you're dealing with the Scottish Free Rite Masonry, it has been the pharaonic control of the world under the guise of Satan himself and under the direction of Satan himself that we're now seeing. And so when we see Anubis coming into the United States, when we see it first on the Thames River, then and with its spear pointed at the Lady Liberty's reproductive area, that's as tactful as I can be. There is such a profound message, only to, I think, end up the last time I heard at the Denver International Airport, which we already covered. But what we're talking about is the spirit of death, Pharaoh's declaration of war upon liberty, war upon the old order, welcoming in the new Ubermensch, the new Supermen, the new transhumanists by the very supernatural impregnation of what we're talking about right now.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, I think, in the second or third hour of this show, how British academics here, I don't know, several years ago actually, wanted to actually raise one of the extinct pharaohs, talking about how they might be able to take, if they could find any intact DNA, and use that. This has been, this is an operative spirit. We're talking about something that is always pressing to come forward into our reality. Sometimes it doesn't need man's permission, sometimes it does, and how that plays a role with the leaders of government, and sometimes the leaders of government are not the ones that you see that walk around wearing the suits with the titles. It's the ones operating behind them. So I'll just finish the ancient side of this, how that Pharaoh then would be transmogrified into the living deity, right? The son of Amun-Ra. He is the representation on earth of the gods. Now, why would you want to do that? One of the people that were interviewing me at the Washington Monument from the History Channel, and by the way, while I was there, there was a huge group of tourists all over the place, and they became so intrigued with everything that we were talking about. I was interviewed for like 2 hours, and by the time it was done, I had just a mass of tourists standing all around just listening to everything that I was saying, which I was thankful for. I almost felt like I was a pastor again, and I had my little pulpit there. But this was a government representation. You go inside the dome where you experience your inauguration. You are transmogrified into the living deity, the son of Amun-Ra and Osiris. And from that day forward... That word, inauguration, you wrote about it. It means to literally partake of the spirit of the ogre, which was a giant who ate flesh. That's what the word means, okay? We take these words, it literally means to augur. You've heard augur in. Well, that means that spirit of that flesh-eating giant, and we're not talking about a funny-looking Shrek here. We're talking about that inauguration literally means to have something outside of you augur in the presence of a giant. Do you follow me? That's why they claim that the president's the most powerful man on earth. In other words, he becomes something before the transmorphification. he becomes something because this, you're right. In fact, there was even a priesthood built around it called the augurs. These were the ones who would actually, they would use their various incantations to make sure that the person who was being inaugurated, who was being endorsed by the gods, had been approved by those other world spirits. And then these augurs could say to the public, hey, here's your new king. Here's your new leader. He has been approved by the gods to be the representation who now, well, that was, of course, very much the same sentiment that was in ancient Egypt when the Pharaoh emerged from the Capitol Dome temple, having been incarnated within him, the new Osiris. He was now the leader of the country. The people could stand back and rejoice at the inauguration. He was the incarnation of the god Horus, the resurrected Osiris, during his lifetime. And then in death, he would experience apotheosis, which also is centrally connected to Washington, D.C., where he would become the Osiris of the underworld, the dying and resurrecting god, the cycle that's repeated with every newly appointed king. So Pharaoh became, just as the God who is ciphered on the Great Seal of the United States will be, and which each U.S. president represents, the Son, the spiritual incarnation of the supreme deity that we call Gilgamesh in Sumeria, Nimrod in the Old Testament, Apollo in Greece, Osiris in Egypt. And in Washington, you have a city now whose government buildings, and this is all stuff, anybody can verify this, the government buildings, the important government buildings, all have their cornerstones dedicated at the astrological times related to the zodiacal constellation Virgo, who is the heavenly representation of Isis. This is a town which was to govern 13 colonies that had been brought together, just as Isis gathered the 13 pieces of Osiris and brought them together. A town that then had the giant obelisk affixed to it, just as Isis affixed